Grit gingerly stepped around the 3 broken bodies that littered the floor like discarded soda cans. His shoes squelched in the pooling blood that had leaked from the gaping holes that adorned the heads of the 3 dead men, while he could feel his feet moving toward the monitors that bathed the room in an eerie eldritch glow. Grit couldn't seem to focus on the movement coming from the few working screens. His eyes were instead locked on the bodies of the dead. The horror that etched its way across Grit's face was both because of the scene in front of him and not at the same time. Grit lifted a violently shaking hand, his mind flickering to the hundreds of hours of therapy sessions he'd attended, his finger slowly erected to point at the bodies, a movement that felt like it denied every person who had ever told him he was just traumatized, that what he had seen couldn't have been real, and was just the machinations of a young mind trying to process a gruesome, terrible scene. Yet, as the finger pointed to the bodies of the dead, he saw not the orderlies who had taken their own lives, but instead, he saw the bodies from memories long ago. Vaguely, Grit could hear Eliza saying something, but it came to his ears distant and muffled, completely incoherent. Part of him wanted to turn and tell Eliza he was okay, that he was just having crazy thoughts again, but he couldn't even turn his head. Every part of him was locked into this memory. Slowly, as he blinked, his eyes clouded over, and he could feel himself being whisked away into the past, into a memory that he had convinced himself could not be. Grit's exuberance was palpable as he pushed his face against the cabin windows. His young cheeks pressed against the glass, watching as clouds could be seen racing by as the plane streaked through the sky. They had been in the air over half a day now, but Grit loved the beautiful blue of the water racing underneath them, and the magical feel that came with soaring through the clouds. A voice came over the intercom saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. We'll be landing shortly. Please buckle in, and we at High Fly would like to be the first to." At this point, Grit had lost focus on the captain's words and was once again teeming with energy as he watched the land below him grow closer and closer. He could see the skyscrapers poking out of the ground like fingers reaching for the planes. He turned and looked at the 3 people sitting next to him. The closest was his mother, Cassandra, a medium-built woman with short blonde hair. She sat engrossed in her latest mystery novel. Next was his chunky little brother, Josh, who had just turned 6 and was a full 6 years younger than Grit. While a little obnoxious at times, Grit and his younger brother got along quite well, and it was very rare that their parents had to settle any disputes between them. More often, they would be found getting into trouble together than anything. And finally was his father, Will. Dressed in a blue pinstriped suit, he sat at the end of the row typing up notes for his next medical journal. The trip they were taking to Beijing, while doubling as a family vacation, was mainly happening because Will was to meet with several scientists at a company known as Zayu. The company's name, when translated to English, roughly meant the cure. Grit had not completely understood everything his father had said about what they were working on, only that his father was extremely excited, and that he believed this to be a huge deal in the advancement of medicine. He had ranted for days about the excessive amounts of screening the company had required before they would even share the smallest details with him. But after working for the CDC for so long, he was used to that sort of thing. "Can never cut through the red tape," he always said. Once they'd shared what information they could, they'd invited him to come see their labs to see more firsthand. Luckily, the family had already been planning a vacation. Its destination just got moved around a bit. Grit didn't mind, though. He was just excited to spend time with his father. The two never had much time together due to his father's arduous work schedule. Grit's mother buckled his brother into his seat, while Grit sat back and strapped himself in. A little while later, they had taken a taxi and were settling into their hotel. Will smiled, buttoning his blazer. "Well, I'll be back. I'm gonna go check in at the lab. Then we can visit some of the local attractions." Cassandra gave Will a disheartening look. "You're leaving already? We just got here." Will shrugged. It won't be long. I just want to let them know I'm here, you know? Grit sighed and went to pull out a board game to play with his little brother. He had heard his dad say things like that before, and it was never just an hour or just a few minutes. They would be lucky to see him before they went to sleep. So, Grit, attempting to ignore the moisture that had gathered in his mother's eyes, set up a game for the three of them, and they played for hours, retiring to bed well before Will stumbled into the hotel, coughing loud enough to make Grit sit up. "Dad?" Coughing into his elbow, trying to lessen the noise, Will whispered to Grit, "Go back to bed, son. Just having a bad reaction to the pollen in the area, I think." Grit stood up, walking over and pouring a glass of water for his father after he wiped the sleep from his own eyes. "How did everything at the meeting go, Dad?" Will sighed deeply. "It went well, son, but you deserve an apology. This trip is meant to be about all of us, not just my work. Not to make excuses, it was just hard to walk away from what they were showing me." Grit gave his dad a placating smile. "I know, Dad. You don't need to apologize. We know your job's important, and you're just trying to help people." Will ruffled his son's hair. "I thought you were supposed to be 12. When did you grow up so fast?" Grit let out a small, pleased chuckle, before hushing himself quickly so as though not to wake the others. "You know, son, I've been meaning to give you something. It was my father's before he passed away." Saying this, Will removed an oak-handled pocket knife from his pocket and handed it to Grit. "Keep it safe, and only use it in case of emergencies. Anyway, let's get some rest. We have a busy day tomorrow." Grit woke up to the sound of coughing coming from the bathroom. Remembering the night before, he filled a glass of water and went to bring it to his father. But when he pushed open the bathroom door, he saw his mother was already there, rubbing Will's back as he hacked up verdant green phlegm. "Dad, here's some water." Will grabbed the glass and drank it down fast, as if he hadn't had water in days. Breathing heavy after drinking the water, his father's coughing subsided. "Seems I might have gotten sick on the flight. Always said planes were flying petri dishes. Anyway, let's have some fun." It was at that point Grit noticed his father had a small bandage on his hand. "What happened, Dad?" Will shook his head. "Oh, that. Just got nipped by a lab mouse yesterday. Don't worry, though. I got it cleaned out well and the mouse was vaccinated. Anyway, let's head into town. A lot to see in a little time." Grit was so excited he all but forgot about his father's coughing. They spent the day touring the Forbidden City, taking in the stunning architecture. Throughout the day, though, Will's cough seemed to get worse. Will went through dozens of bottles of water as they walked, and while everyone wanted to head back to the hotel so he could rest, Will kept saying that he had ruined one day already and didn't want to ruin another. So they tried their best to enjoy the day, even with Will's coughing growing worse and worse. By the time the sun had gone down, and they had returned to their hotel room, Grit could feel the heat radiating off of his father, but instead of pale or red skin of a normal illness, his father's skin had a shade of olive green look to it. While Cassandra pleaded with Will to get seen, he insisted all that he needed was just a little rest. Eventually, Grit could hear them agree that if Will wasn't better by morning, he would go to the hospital. Laying down, Grit tried to count sheep, but never made it past 15. Because each time he got close, his father's wet, ragged coughs echoed in the small room. Grit would lose count and have to start over. Eventually, though, the exhaustion of the long day took over, and Grit's eyes fluttered closed. Sometime in the middle of the night, Grit shuddered, and he woke to the sound of nasty, wet sound coming from the bathroom. Sitting up, he saw he was alone in the room. Worried his father had gotten worse, Grit rushed to get up and move toward the bathroom. He was about to fling open the door and see what was going on, when a feeling he didn't recognize made him pause. Instead of throwing the door open, Grit quietly eased it open. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. Both his brother and his mother were lying motionless on the crimson-stained bathroom floor. Will was in the process of ripping off another morsel from Cassandra's motionless body. Blood dripped from Will's stained lips. The scene was too much. A feeling of deep unreality washed over Grit, and without meaning to, he realized he was whimpering. The sound caused Will's head to shoot up. His face turned toward Grit, showing that thick, thorny vines had erupted from within his throat, tearing through his cheeks, creating a Glasgow smile. Still chewing a piece of Cassandra, Will lurched forward toward Grit. Grit backed up fast, slamming the door in the face of the monstrosity that used to be his father. Immediately, he could hear him pounding against the fragile wood. Then, as Grit turned to sprint out of the door, an arm went through the fiberboard door. The arm of his father gripped his shirt through the hole that now decorated the door. Another hand shot through the door, this one not belonging to Will, but belonging to Cassandra. For the merest of moments, Grit felt a bit of relief in the thought his mother was alive and would save him. But her hands were not reaching to pull Will off of Grit. They were reaching to pull Grit through the quickly failing wood of the door. Grit screamed, and in an act of desperation, pulled the pocket knife from his pants, the very pocket knife that his father had given him only a day earlier, and drove it into his father's clutching arm. As the knife went through flesh and then struck bone, the arm didn't withdraw as Grit had hoped. It didn't do so much as flinch as he tried again and again, stabbing the blade into the arm, so much so that the muscle was parted and the white gleam of bone was showing through. After what seemed like the third or fourth time Grit had tried to cut into his father's arm, he instead pushed away from his father and cut through the shirt that he was being detained by. The knife, while old, was still well maintained, and it cut cleanly through the soft cotton of Grit's shirt. Now freed, Grit turned and bolted toward the front door. As he did, the wood of the bathroom door weakened from the multiple holes now perforating its structure. Then it gave way, the corpse of his father bursting through toward him, through the wood, grabbing Grit's arm. Knife still in hand, Grit turned, and before he knew what he was doing, he had taken the blade and plunged it into the temple of the creature, causing it to go limp and fall to the ground, the knife still embedded in its skull. Turning, not waiting for the creature that was his mother to reach out for him, Grit moved to fling the door to the hallway open. But before he could turn the handle, the door pushed open of its own accord, and 3 men outfitted in gear Grit had only seen in video games busted in the room. One of the men grabbed Grit by the arm, pulling him into the hallway, but not before he saw verdant-colored blood spew from his mother's head, as the men opened fire on what used to be his family. Grit spewed chunks onto the floor as he saw his family drop to the floor like rag dolls. The next couple of hours were hazy for Grit. He remembered someone drawing his blood, then being put on a plane back to the United States, where a doctor told him again and again that his father had shot his mother and brother before turning the gun on himself, and that the story that Grit had seen, or he thought he'd seen, the things that he described, was just his mind wanting to protect him from blaming his father for what had happened to his family. It was then that they told him that, while quite a handsome amount of money had been left for him, he would be residing at the asylum until he felt sure about the truth of what actually happened to his family. And so the years passed, and then he was blinking again, and he had realized all this had flashed through his mind in an instant, when the rusty scent of blood was replaced by the pleasant smell of artificial strawberries. Grit blinked his eyes again, fast, seeing that Eliza was using a shaking hand to wave scented chapstick under his nose, a trick they had learned to help cope with flashbacks during a mindfulness training. Grit shook his head, this time not forcing the memories away, but accepting them and allowing himself to know their truth. He turned toward Eliza. "This is bad. I think I know what is happening. And if I'm right, this thing will spread fast. If it hasn't already, we don't even know what it's like outside. Maybe that's why they took the TVs and the newspapers away. We need to gather supplies, Eliza. I know it seems heartless not to let everyone else out, but we need to keep ourselves safe first. The 2 places I think are best to get those things that we need would be the kitchen and the medical bay." Eliza shook her head vigorously. I don't want to go back to the kitchen. Not after everything that happened with Joe. Grit grimaced. Neither do I, but I'm worried it'll be even worse outside. Eliza took in a sharp breath. You mean you really think it's going to be worse out there than it is in here? Grit gave a non-committal shrug. I'm not sure, but if it is, we need to be prepared. To the medical bay it is then, Eliza said, once more checking the revolver she held in her hands. We only have 2 shots. I really don't want to use this thing, though. I think it might draw attention neither of us want. Grit grimaced and pressed his back against the door. Then slowly he eased it open. The hallway directly outside was still and silent. Green and red fluids alike splattered across the walls, and Carl's still, unmoving form laid out in its final resting place. Grit let out a shuddering breath as he looked down at the knife that was still clutched in his hands. He was always nice, that. I remember one time he brought small gifts for everyone without families to visit them on Christmas. He got me a true crime novel. My therapist wouldn't let me keep it, but it's the thought that counts, right? Grit smiled at the memory. Then the smile dropped from his face as he was pulled back into the vicious reality, a reality where he had killed Carl. Eliza patted Grit on the shoulder comfortingly. You only did what you had to. Anyway, I'd be dead if it weren't for you. Or worse, she said, shaking as she thought of her shambling around like one of those creatures. Anyway, let's go. They started making their way through the dimly lit hallway, treading carefully, unsure of what might lay in wait for them. But as they moved, it seemed as though there was no one else around. The only sound were the buzzing of the fluorescent lights and their footsteps on the linoleum floor. That was until they were getting close to the entrance of the medical bay. There, they could hear what sounded like rattling of chains, as well as several voices calling out in unison for help. Eliza went to run into the room when Grit caught her by the arm. Something doesn't feel right. Just listen. Eliza's face screwed up in anger, and it seemed as though she was about to yell at Grit when she noticed it too. The voices were repeating themselves, the same words at the same time, as if they had rehearsed their lines so they could speak as one. And even through the thrum of voices, the sound of rattling chains set their teeth on edge. The look of anger on Eliza's face melted into one of uncertainty. I hear it too. So what do you want to do? Grit put his forefinger to his lips in a sign that they should be quiet. Then he slowly crept up to the plexiglass window affixed into the medical bay door. What he saw through the window made bile rise in his throat. The medical bay was an absolute mess. Several tables and chairs had been overturned. Blood could be seen coagulating on the floor, mixed with the all-too-familiar green fluid that hinted at the presence of the putrescent creatures that infested the hospital. Then, Grit's eyes caught movement on both sides of the room. Handcuffed and restrained to several of the overturned beds were creatures similar to the ones they'd encountered earlier in the day. Similar, but not the same. The green veins that bulged from the skin on the others was not as apparent on these ones, and their faces were not adorned with the signature Chelsea grin. Instead, their mouths were stitched shut by thin razor-like vines, reminding Grit vaguely of roses. Tearing his eyes away from the horrific creature, Grit glanced around frantically, searching for the origin of the pleading voices. It was then that he noticed one feature that made these creatures all the more terrifying. There was a thin line running horizontally through the creature's esophagus. The line was so discreet that Grit wouldn't have noticed it, except for when the next volley of fearful pleas ripped through the air, the line opened to reveal rows of razor-like vines that were tucked away in their necks like the maw of a frenzied shark. This time, When bile rose in Grit's throat, he couldn't choke it back down, and he painted the linoleum with a layer of partially digested baked beans. Eliza rushed to his side, carefully sidestepping the puddle of brown goo. "Are you okay?" Grit rubbed the back of his hand across his mouth, spitting out the remains of the acidic fluid. "Baked beans is not a meal, and it tastes worse the second time." Eliza let out a weak chuckle, shaking her head. "What did you see?" Grit just sighed heavily, pointing to the window for her to look. Moments later, he was holding her hair back as she too vomited from the sight. Once she had thoroughly evacuated her stomach, Eliza said, "At least they're restrained, so we should be safe. Just be careful." Together, Eliza and Grit placed their hand on the cool metal of the door. Then Grit slid the security badge over the flashing panel, causing an audible click. As the lock disengaged slowly, tensely, they pushed open the heavy metal door, sweat beading on Grit's brow. All his senses were on high. They stepped into the foul-smelling room, where the only sound that could be heard was the movement of their feet. This anomaly did not escape Grit's notice. He turned to Eliza, mouthing, "They stopped." While no sound escaped Grit's lips, it seemed as though the mouthing of the words acted like a catalyst, as all four of the mimicking creatures started gibbering their own nonsense. Some were still pleading for help, while others were crying out for a god that had obviously forsaken them, and some were simply screaming as if the final death throes of their last moments had not ended. Their words were all different, but their actions were all the same. All were bucking against their restraints, the mouths of their necks unhinging and slamming shut, causing the heads on top of their shoulders to snap back and forth, as if experiencing several partial decapitations. Eliza and Grit's sneaking crawl quickly transformed into a mad dash as they sprinted down the center aisle, at one point mere inches from the snapping jowls of one of the mimics. Making it across the room, Grit frantically pressed the security key to the medroom locking panel, only to see a disheartening red light flash across the top of the device. He tried again, his breathing panicked, only to yield the same results. Turning to Eliza, he had to shout to be heard over the din of the mimics. "What do we do now?" Eliza turned to scan the room, racking her brain to remember something from her stay in the medical ward. She immediately recognized the face of one of the writhing mimics as Nancy, the head nurse. Around her left wrist, dangling and bobbing from a bandolier, was a white key card. Before Grit knew what she was doing, Eliza had raised the pistol and fired off a shaky shot into one of the creature's heads. The cacophony of voices devolved into a slow, steady ringing as Grit's ears recovered from the unexpected blast. By the time he could hear again, Eliza had already swiped the key and was pushing open the medroom door. Rapidly, another blast followed, and an emaciated creature toppled out of the closet, slumping to the floor with a dull thud. Eliza breathed heavily, eyes wide as she realized how close she had come to being eaten. Grit shook her shoulder gently, forcing her to come back to reality. The two stepped over their would-be assailant. Much of the med closet was in a disarray, seeming battered by the creature's numerous attempts to escape. Nonetheless, most of the medication was still intact. The two each grabbed a nurse bag from the back of the room, then started shoveling handfuls of medication into them. Once they were halfway full, they began gathering living essentials. Blankets, scrubs, toiletries, and first aid supplies made their way into the bags. For a blessed moment it seemed as though they may not have to go to the cafeteria as they happened upon a serving cart. Opening up the sheet metal doors only revealed 2 cans of beans and a moldy tortilla, though. Grit packed the cans away while Eliza simply glared at the offending cans. Shouldering the bags that were now packed almost bursting, the two made a mad dash out of the medical bay. As the heavy metal doors shut behind them, the incongruent shrieks of the mimics slowly shifted back to the layered droning of voices begging for help. Shivering from the terror-laden experience, the two started walking the miserable trudge that would take them to the cafeteria. They were halfway through the ravaged maze of hallways when the distant sound of an explosion rocked the building. Grit, whose nerves were already fried from the trip back into his past, and then the harrowing experience at the medical bay, let out a shrill scream. Eliza, who wore a shocked expression, looked over at Grit. "Any idea what that was?" Grit's hands were trembling as he tried hard to get his emotions under control. I have no idea, but it seems like we're going to find out. The sound came from near the cafeteria. No sooner than when the words had escaped his lips, 2 men came running down the hallway toward them. Each held a gun, one a rifle, the other a small pistol. Eliza quickly raised her own weapon, which caused the 2 approaching men to slow to a halt. The one holding the pistol, a pale, bone-thin-looking man, wearing a threadbare wife beater that sported splatters of both verdant green and drying crimson, sneered at Eliza holding the pistol. "You even know how to use that, little girl? I bet you never even shot nobody before. Why don't you come over here and I'll take you back home and show you how I shoot before you hurt yourself." He licked his black and brown stained teeth as he uttered the last part. His partner, a more sturdy-looking individual who stood around 6'2" and had muscle behind his size, shook his head in disgust. "Noah, stop being a prick. You're gonna give these 2 the wrong idea. Look, we don't want to hurt you. We're here to find supplies as well as other survivors to join our group. Things have been bad outside. We only heard recently that this place had remained basically untouched by the virus for some time, although I guess that's not exactly true, considering what we had found in the cafeteria. Anyway, I see you already have quite the cache of supplies for yourself. We don't want to force it from you." "The hell we don't!" the thin man interjected. "We take what we want, and afterwards we'll decide if they're useful." This time, the burly man drove a sharp elbow into the thin man's gut, who in turn swung a jab into his partner's face. The bigger of the 2 took the punch without flinching, then bared down on Noah, who seemed to shrink down under the intimidating man. Eliza and Grit stood in stunned silence, staring at the 2, not quite sure what to do or even exactly what was going on. After the scuffle ended, the 2 composed themselves, and the tall man spoke again. "If you just hand over your pistol, we can do this nice and easy. I'll take you to my boss, and he'll probably invite you to come back with us. And you may even be able to keep most of what you gathered here today." Grit nodded while chewing his bottom lip. He knew they had no more ammo, and that the gun Eliza held was no more than a small bluff, and he did not want them to die for that, not now after everything they had done to survive today. Eliza shook nervously, but acquiesced and handed over the pistol to the burly one, who tucked it into his belt. Then they walked Grit and Eliza at gunpoint toward the cafeteria. As they reached the hallway that would lead to their destination, it became quickly obvious what had made the large boom. A massive hole had been blasted into the side of the building. Crumbling cement littered the floor, and parked in the center of the hole looked to be a militarized Humvee, and sitting on top of the hood was a large bear of a man. His face held a thick coat of hair, and his plaid shirt mixed with the overalls he wore made him look much more ready to cut wood than to be at home sitting on top of an assault vehicle. He lifted his head as Grit, Eliza, and the 2 men approached. "Survivors. Welcome. Oh, shit. They attack you?" the man said, referring to the burly man's face, which now had puffed up from the punch delivered to him from his comrade. "No, boss. Noah was threatening these 2 and acting like he was going to force himself on this young lady. When I told him to mind his manners, he socked me in the face." Anger, white hot, flashed across the man on the car's face as he stood to his feet. "We talked about this, Noah. Last time I told you that I wouldn't warn you again. And now I hear you attacked one of our own just so you can go against our rules." Noah's already pale physique went white as a ghost then, and before he could as much as stumble out a reply, the report of a gun cut him off, and a small red dot blossomed on his forehead as he fell to the ground. Holstering the .38 special that he had quickly drawn, the man watched Noah slump to the floor, then turned back toward Grit and Eliza. "I apologize about how one of my men treated you, and that you had to see that. We have rules, and he'd broken them before. This time was just the last straw." Eliza's face held a look of horror and confusion as she stuttered out, "Who are you?" "We are the Jacks, a group who've been surviving the mess that's been happening outside, although I don't know if you understand how bad it is yet. We came here for supplies and to recruit more hands from those that are still alive. Well, we won't force you to join us. I suggest you take the offer because either way, we'll be needing the medicine you're carrying. Now, my dear listeners, it is your time to decide the future of our story. Eliza and Grit have been through a lot today, but it seems as though they might have found some help. Or have they? Well, will they go with the Jacks? More people means more safety, right? And maybe they can learn more about what's going on. Or will they give up the supplies and try to go their own way? These people seem unpredictable, and that could be dangerous. Or will they do something else? If you have a suggestion, write it in the comments. If it gets the most likes by the time we write the next episode, we'll go with your suggestion. Most importantly, thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so that you can see our next episode, so you can see your choices in action. Thank you, and until next time, let's write a story. Let's play a game without the dice.